All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating theological argument from the writer Said Nursi. He makes this incredible case that just a few specific verses in the Quran are actually packed with a whole series of detailed, miraculous predictions about the future. So let's take a look at what he found. So these are the key verses we're going to be looking at, right from the end of a chapter called Surah al-Fath. Now, according to the analysis we're exploring, these lines are so much more than just a declaration of faith. They're seen as being just completely woven through with prophecy. And that really brings us to the big question, right? Can a sacred text actually hold specific, verifiable predictions about what's to come? The author we're studying argues that the answer is a huge yes, and that these verses right here are a perfect example. So the way he breaks it down is by framing this whole passage as a kind of multi-layered miracle of foreknowledge. He claims it contains at least 7 different distinct predictions about the unseen, events that were just impossible to know at that time. All right, so let's dive into the core of this whole thing. We're going to walk through each one of these so-called 7 prophetic flashes to see exactly what the author says was predicted. First up, we have what's presented as the most direct prediction of them all, and it's about one of the most pivotal moments in early Islamic history, the conquest of Mecca. And the key phrase here is this specific promise. The author argues this was a crystal-clear prediction given to the Prophet Muhammad that he and his followers would enter Mecca's sacred mosque. And as history tells us, just 2 years after this was revealed, that's exactly what happened. Okay, prediction number 2. This one's really interesting because it's all about something that, at first glance, actually looked like a loss for the early Muslims, the Truce of Hudaybiyah. So what was this Truce of Hudaybiyah? Well, it was a peace treaty. And honestly, a lot of the Prophet's followers at the time felt like they got the short end of the stick, that it was a bad deal for them. And this is where the interpretation gets really fascinating. The author argues that even though the treaty looked like a defeat, it was actually a brilliant strategic victory in disguise. This break in the fighting allowed what he calls the diamond sword of the Qur'an to win over hearts and minds, which in turn led to legendary figures like the warrior Khalid ibn al-Walid converting to Islam. Now for number 3. This prediction actually builds right on top of that first one about entering Mecca, but it focuses on how they would enter. I mean, look at that phrase, without fear. It seems so simple, but the argument is that this tiny phrase is another huge prediction. Think about it. At the time, the early Muslims were literally surrounded by enemies. This verse promises they'd enter Mecca without fear, which the author says foretold the eventual submission of the entire Arabian Peninsula, a state of total safety that must have seemed absolutely impossible back then. Okay, for our 4th prediction, things get, well, a lot bigger. The scope just explodes, moving way beyond Arabia to make a claim about Islam's role in the entire world. So this really puts it into perspective, right? At the time this was revealed, the followers of Islam were just a small group up against these massive, dominant world religions. And yet, the verse predicts it will triumph over all religion. The source then points to history as proof, noting how Islam's influence did in fact spread from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. Now, this next one is a bit different. It's more subtle, more like a hidden code, you could say. The author argues that tucked away inside the description of the Prophet's companions are clues about the identities and the key personality traits of the first 4 leaders who would succeed him, the Rightly-Guided Caliphs. So check out how the author connects these phrases directly to the 4 caliphs. Those who are with him is said to point to Abu Bakr, who was known for his incredibly close friendship with the Prophet. Strong against the unbelievers? That's Umar, famous for his powerful conquests. Compassionate among each other? Hints at Usman, who died trying to stop infighting among Muslims. And bow and prostrate themselves? That points to Ali, who is celebrated for his deep piety and devotion. Okay, number 6 is really unique, because here the claim is that the Quran itself is pointing to a parallel prophecy in another holy book, the Torah. So the argument here is twofold. First, it claims that a description of the Prophet's companions already exists in the Torah. And second, it predicts their devotion would be so intense that the actual marks from their prostrations in prayer would become visible on their faces, a physical sign of piety. And that takes us to number 7, the final prophetic flash. And just like the last one, it points to another description, this time one found in the Gospel. You have this beautiful metaphor of a seed growing into a strong plant.
The author sees this as a perfect prediction of the Muslim community's journey. It starts out small, maybe a little weak, like a tiny sprout, but then it grows, gets stronger, and stands on its own, eventually becoming so successful that it fills unbelievers with rage. This, the author says, is precisely what played out in the decades that followed.
But wait, there's more. The analysis doesn't just stop with those 7 predictions. The author goes even deeper, arguing for another level of interpretation altogether, one that involves hidden allusions and, well, codes. Now, to really get this next level, you have to understand a concept called tevafuk. This isn't coincidence, like, oh, what a coincidence. It's used here to describe meaningful, divinely intended patterns in the very letters and words of the verses, almost like a hidden mathematical or structural blueprint beneath the text.
Okay, so what's the big picture here? What does this all mean when you put it together? The direct prophecies, the subtle hints, and these numerical patterns. So what we're really seeing is this idea of layers of meaning. On the surface, you've got these explicit predictions about big future events. Peel that back, and you find these clever allusions to the people who would shape the future. And if you go even deeper, the author claims you find these numerological patterns that suggest a deliberate divine architecture to the whole thing. And, this whole analysis really leaves you with a big question to chew on. When we're looking at a sacred text, where do you draw the line between history and prophecy, or between human interpretation and divine meaning? It really makes you think about the incredible ways that faith and deep textual analysis can come together to find meaning in ancient words.